Tonight, we open a door few have even dared to approach, a place where history is not merely stored, but controlled, where entire centuries can vanish without leaving a trace. Hidden beneath the stones of Vatican City lies a vault so immense it stretches beyond imagination, holding manuscripts, maps, letters, and relics that could rewrite everything we think we know. For over 400 years it has been guarded, not just by walls and locks, but by silence, the kind that can smother questions before they are even asked. This is not just about religious history. This is about political power, about knowledge used as a weapon, about events that may never have happened and events that did but were erased from memory. Whispers of secret trials, forbidden gospels, and ancient prophecies linger in the air, each one locked away from the eyes of the world. And those who tried to bring them into the light often vanished from the story themselves. The Vatican Apostolic Archive does not simply protect the past, it decides which past we are allowed to see. So, before you think these are only dusty scrolls and harmless records, remember this. Somewhere behind those doors lies a truth so profound, so disruptive, that its very existence could shake the foundations of faith, power, and history itself. Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we go inside. And some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Beneath the heart of Vatican City lies a silence so deep it feels older than time itself. Past the marble halls and sunlit plazas, under layers of stone that have stood for centuries, there is a hidden world few will ever see. It is said that behind massive doors of iron and oak, corridors stretch for miles, lined with shelves that vanish into darkness. Each shelf carries the weight of centuries, holding manuscripts, maps, letters, and relics so rare they could rewrite everything we think we know about history, but no tourist will ever walk there. No camera has been allowed to roam those aisles freely. This is the Vatican Apostolic Archive, and stepping inside without permission is impossible. Those who have caught a glimpse speak of a smell like ancient dust mixed with something metallic, of air that feels still and heavy as if it remembers more than the living world above. You can almost picture it now, dim light falling on stacks of parchment, seals still intact, wax unbroken since the day it was pressed by the hands of kings, scientists, and saints. Some of these documents are older than most nations, some may be older than the church itself, and each one is locked away from the eyes of the world. The official story says the archive is nothing more than a secure library for preserving the church's history, a place for scholars to study papal records, letters, and diplomatic exchanges. But if that were true, why such secrecy? Why limit access to only a handful of people each year, forcing them to request a single document at a time, never to browse freely? Why are there entire sections even the most trusted researchers are forbidden to enter? Imagine if one of those rooms contained proof that the history you were taught in school was only part of the truth. Imagine if inside was a letter that showed events we thought were accidents were actually planned, or a map proving continents were known long before they were officially discovered. Rumours swirl about what lies within. Lost Gospels, secret trials, ancient prophecies, documents describing miracles in one century, and inventions centuries ahead of their time in another. There are whispers of records that could clear the names of the condemned, or reveal the hands of the guilty in the grandest events of human history. And somewhere in those miles of shelves, there might be writings that question not only the past, but the very timeline we live in now. The deeper you think about it, the stranger it becomes. Why guard something so fiercely unless it has the power to change everything? The Vatican will never tell you exactly what lies behind those doors, but maybe the real question is not what they are keeping safe. Maybe it is what they are keeping us safe from. And if that is the case, you have to wonder, safe from the truth, or from the chaos the truth might bring? There is a single entrance to the Vatican Apostolic Archive. and it does not look like the gateway to one of the most guarded collections of knowledge on Earth. No golden doors, no grand arches, just a heavy barrier that leads into a quiet, unmarked space. It is here that the journey begins for the few granted access each year. A journey lined with rules so strict that stepping out of line by even a breath means immediate expulsion. To enter, you cannot simply knock or send an email. You must be a recognized scholar, holding credentials from a respected academic institution, and even then, your request must be backed by a very specific reason. You have to name the exact document you wish to see, as if you already know it exists, and explain why you need it. You will not be allowed to browse. You will not wander the aisles as though in a library. Instead, if your request is approved, someone will fetch the document for you while you wait in a controlled reading room under the watchful eye of archivists. They will hand it to you like a sacred relic, and you will be allowed to view it for a limited time. You may take notes, but you may not copy it in full. Photography is forbidden. Certain sections are completely off limits, no matter who you are. The strangest part is that the Vatican does not deny the existence of these restricted areas. They simply state that some documents are too fragile or too sensitive for general study. Yet no one explains why papers centuries old can be viewed by a select few, but not by others who meet the same qualifications. Over the years, scholars have quietly shared what this process feels like. Some describe it as stepping into a courtroom where the walls themselves are the jury, watching every move. Others say the tension is so thick you can feel the unspoken warning that you are being allowed a rare privilege that could be taken away at any moment. For all the talk about the archive being a treasure trove for historical research, its rules seem built not for sharing knowledge, but for controlling it. Why is that? Why would an institution, claiming to preserve history for the good of humanity, design a system that keeps it hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and secrecy? Perhaps the answer lies not in what the public sees, but in what it never will. Behind that guarded door may be stories so disruptive they could change the way people see the church, history, or even the world itself. And until someone finds a way past those invisible walls, the truth will remain on the other side, locked away in a silence that has lasted for centuries. Ask the Vatican about the Apostolic Archive, and the answer sounds simple, almost harmless. It is, they say, the Church's private library, a place where records of centuries past are kept safe from damage, theft, or decay. According to their official statement, the archive holds letters between popes and kings, reports from missionaries, ancient maps of church lands, and the official acts of papal courts. It is not, they insist, a place of mystery or conspiracy. It is simply a working archive, like those of any government, meant to store the documents of its own history. They say it was established to preserve the legacy of the Church and to serve as a reliable source for scholars who wish to study it. The tone is always calm, measured, reassuring, as if the only secrets behind those doors are the kind that matter to historians and no one else. They explain that privacy is necessary. After all, some records contain personal details about people who lived and died long ago, or sensitive diplomatic exchanges that could still affect relationships between nations. They remind the world that every government protects its archives for the same reasons. And to those who imagine hidden treasures and earth-shaking revelations, the Vatican replies that the real treasure is the history itself. It is an answer designed to sound complete, yet somehow it leaves a hollow space where the truth should be. Because if the archive is no different from any other, why do so few people have access? Why can only a handful of carefully chosen scholars cross its threshold each year? Why do they have to name the exact document they want before they even step inside? The official story never mentions the sealed rooms no one may enter, the manuscripts whispered about in the corridors of academia, or the rumours of discoveries so sensitive they never see daylight. Instead, it paints a picture of quiet order, of history neatly filed away, of caretakers whose only mission is to protect fragile pages from the slow destruction of time. It is a picture that works well for public trust, but like a painting, it shows only what the artist allows. What is left outside the frame might be just as important, perhaps even more so, than what is inside. And so the official story is repeated year after year, unchanged, unwavering, a story that invites no further questions. Yet, the more you hear it, the more it sounds like the beginning of a riddle rather than its answer. Perhaps that is its true purpose. Not to explain, but to settle curiosity before it can grow. Because once curiosity starts pulling on a loose thread, you never know how much of the fabric might come undone. For every polite answer the Vatican gives about the Apostolic Archive, there are questions they never seem willing to face. If the archive truly holds nothing more than routine records and harmless history, why is it so tightly guarded? Why limit access to a handful of carefully approved scholars each year? Why force them to request a single document instead of allowing them to explore? Why lock away entire sections where even those scholars cannot go? These are not questions born from wild imagination. They are the questions that naturally rise when secrecy and history sit together in the same room. Because when you think about it, protecting history is about sharing it, not hiding it. A manuscript locked in a vault does nothing for the world. A letter sealed away for centuries cannot teach, inspire, or correct the mistakes of the past. So, if these pages remain unread by the public, what could they possibly contain? Could there be documents showing that events we accept as fact were recorded differently at the time? Could there be letters from rulers admitting to plans that never made it into the history books? Could there be evidence of knowledge far ahead of its supposed time, knowledge that might force us to rewrite the story of human progress? And if such things exist, who decides whether we are ready to know them? The Vatican often says it is a matter of preservation, that light, handling, and exposure could damage fragile works. That may be true for some items, but it does not explain why many are kept off limits for reasons that have nothing to do with age or condition. It does not explain why certain materials, though preserved perfectly, have never been studied outside the Church's control. The absence of answers only fuels the idea that there is more to the story. Perhaps some documents would change the way people see religion, not in small ways, but in ways that shake the very foundation of faith for millions. Perhaps some papers would reveal political alliances and betrayals stretching across centuries, exposing the Church not just as a spiritual guide, but as a powerful player in the game of nations. Or perhaps they guard something even stranger, something that does not fit neatly into our understanding of history at all. Whatever the case, silence is the perfect shield. As long as no one can read those hidden pages, their contents remain whatever the gatekeepers say they are, and when a story is sealed that tightly, the question is no longer whether it is true. The question becomes, what truth could be so powerful, so dangerous, that the safest place for it is in the dark? The Vatican Apostolic Archive as we know it began to take shape in the early 17th century under Pope Paul V. Before that time, the Church held vast collections of documents scattered across different locations, stored in various palaces, libraries, and private chambers. Many of these records were accessible only to a small circle of clerics and advisors. Pope Paul decided it was time to gather the Church's written memory into one central place, not only to protect it from loss or theft, but also to ensure that its most valuable knowledge could be controlled from the heart of Vatican City. In the year 1611, he issued orders to consolidate thousands of manuscripts, letters, and records into a secure, dedicated space. The term Apostolic Archive would come to mean more than just a library. It was to be a fortress of information, a treasury of the Church's past, its relationships with kings and emperors, its involvement in wars and treaties, its role in shaping laws, and its influence over science and art. The move was not purely about preservation. In those days, Europe was shifting, empires rising and falling, ideas spreading faster than the Church could contain them. By centralizing its records, the Vatican was doing more than keeping them safe. It was building a vault of influence, a place where history itself could be guarded, shaped, or withheld as needed. The decision reflected the mindset of the time. Knowledge was power, and power was not meant to be shared freely. Only those deemed loyal and worthy would be trusted to read the true accounts of events. From the beginning, the archive was divided into levels of access. Some materials could be viewed by church officials, others only by the Pope himself, and some by no one at all. The building that housed the archive was designed to keep the outside world away. Its corridors were plain and unwelcoming, its walls thick enough to resist fire and damp, its entrances watched at all times. Over the years, the collection grew as papal envoys returned from distant lands, carrying reports and rare manuscripts. Some were diplomatic gifts, others were seized during conflicts, and some were quietly purchased from desperate nobles or scholars. By the end of Pope Paul's reign, the archive had become one of the most important centres of hidden knowledge in the world. What began as a project to bring order to the Church's paperwork had become something far greater, a guarded heart where the story of centuries was kept under lock and key. From that moment, the Apostolic Archive was no longer just about history. It was about control over the memory of humanity itself. From the moment the Apostolic Archive was born, its shelves began to fill with documents from every corner of the known world. Some arrived as gifts from rulers seeking favour with the Pope, sealed in leather cases bearing royal crests. Others came through the Church's vast network of missionaries who travelled to distant lands carrying the word of God and returning with the words of kings, scholars and merchants. But not every document in the archive was given freely. In times of war or political change, the Church often found itself in possession of manuscripts and records taken from defeated rulers or dissolved institutions. Entire libraries were absorbed into Vatican custody under the promise of protection, though the original owners would never see them again. In some cases, the Church simply purchased collections from impoverished nobles or desperate collectors who had no idea what they were giving away. The most mysterious acquisitions came quietly, with no public record of how they entered the archive. These were the papers seized during investigations of heresy or confiscated from groups the Church considered dangerous, such as the Knights Templar. Often, these documents contained knowledge or accounts that did not fit with the version of history the Church was prepared to share. Once inside the Vatican's walls, these materials disappeared from public sight, locked away where no one outside the inner circles could study them. Over the centuries, the collection became a mirror of the Church's reach. As Catholic influence spread through Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, so too did the flow of documents back to Rome. Letters from missionaries described cultures and discoveries unknown to the rest of the world. Reports from explorers detailed coastlines and trade routes long before they appeared on public maps. Political treaties, personal confessions of monarchs, secret arrangements between rival powers, all of it found its way to the same guarded shelves. By the 18th century, the archive was no longer just a record of the Church's past. It had become a repository of the world's secrets, a place where information of immense value was gathered and stored beyond the reach of any single nation. Every piece was part of a puzzle, and only the Vatican knew how all the pieces fit together. Some of these acquisitions were celebrated within church circles as victories for preservation, but others were never spoken of again, as if their very existence was too dangerous to acknowledge. In this way, the legacy of collection became more than history. It became a story of power built not on armies or weapons, but on the possession of knowledge that could change the course of nations if ever revealed. There was a time when power was measured only in armies, in how many soldiers a ruler could command, or how many castles flew his banner. But as the centuries turned, another form of power began to rise, quieter yet far more enduring. It was the power to shape the story of the past. When you control history, you control how people see the present. and when you control how they see the present, you influence the choices they make about the future. The Vatican understood this long before most. Every document in the Apostolic Archive was more than ink and parchment. It was a piece of the world's memory, and whoever decided which pieces were remembered and which were forgotten could bend the truth without ever lifting a sword. An inconvenient alliance between two kingdoms could be softened in the official records to make it appear holy and righteous. A scientific discovery that challenged church teaching could vanish into a locked chest, leaving future generations to believe it had never existed. Whole wars could be reframed as divine missions rather than battles for power. Over time, this control became more strategic. The Church did not need to forge history from scratch. It only needed to preserve the parts that supported its authority and quietly allow the rest to fade into silence. This was more than censorship. It was engineering reality. Armies might conquer cities, but knowledge could conquer minds, and a mind once convinced does not need to be forced. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Vatican's role as keeper of history was as powerful as any crown in Europe. Kings came and went, empires rose and fell, but the records stored beneath Vatican City remained, shaping the narrative of each era. Even modern governments have used the archive to confirm treaties or settle disputes, turning to it as the ultimate authority on what really happened centuries ago. Yet, this reliance also means that the version of events the archive offers is taken as truth without question. Few ever ask what might be missing from that truth, or why it is missing at all. And that is the genius of controlling knowledge. Once the official story has been accepted for long enough, it becomes almost impossible to challenge. People build their beliefs, their laws, even their identities on it. To change it would mean rewriting not just history books, but the very foundation of how the world understands itself. Armies can be defeated, kingdoms can be overthrown, but a carefully crafted version of the past can live forever, guiding the course of nations long after the swords have rusted away. In the vaults of the Apostolic Archive, that power still rests, silent, patient, and perhaps more influential than any weapon ever forged. From the very beginning, not every shelf in the Apostolic Archive was meant to be seen. In the early 17th century, as the collection was being gathered under Pope Paul V, certain documents were quietly set aside in rooms with heavier locks and stricter keys. These were not just fragile manuscripts needing protection from light or air. They were records considered too sensitive for even trusted scholars to examine. Some came from political negotiations between rival kingdoms, where the Church acted as an unseen mediator. If the details were made public, they could have shattered alliances or exposed betrayals that were still shaping European politics at the time. Others were transcripts of trials in which powerful figures confessed to acts the Church could never acknowledge without damaging its own authority. Among these early locked rooms were also rumoured to be theological writings that questioned, accepted doctrine, or presented alternate interpretations of Scripture, ideas considered dangerous, not because they lacked evidence, but because they might spread too easily if ever read beyond the walls. In some cases, the secrecy may have been meant to protect lives. A letter revealing the identity of a covert ally in a hostile court could mean death for that person if discovered. But in many other cases, the secrecy served to protect the image of the Church itself. The locked rooms were not labelled or marked on any official inventory. Their existence was known only to a small circle of archivists and papal advisors. Even those who worked in the outer halls of the archive could spend a lifetime there without ever seeing the inside of one. Occasionally, a rumour would leak into the world outside. A visiting dignitary might hint at seeing a document that contradicted a well-known historical account. A scholar might admit to being told that a certain subject was off limits without being given a reason. These whispers only deepened the sense of mystery surrounding the locked rooms. Over the centuries, more materials were added to them, Sometimes entire chests were brought in from other parts of Europe under armed guard. Sometimes a single scroll would arrive wrapped in plain cloth, its delivery unmarked by ceremony. Each edition strengthened the idea that there were truths inside the Vatican that were never meant for ordinary eyes. And so the early locked rooms became the heart of the archive's reputation. They were a place where history could be hidden, reshaped, or protected depending on who held the key. To this day, no complete record exists of what went into them during those first years. Whatever stories those documents tell, they remain silent behind doors that have not been opened for centuries. There came a moment when the Apostolic Archive stopped being simply a vault for preserving the past and became a weapon in shaping the future. Historians cannot point to a single date etched in stone, but the shift began in the 17th and 18th centuries when the Church realized that the knowledge it held was more than memory, it was leverage. Inside those walls were letters between kings that could undo alliances, treaties whose secret clauses could humiliate entire nations, and accounts of events that differed sharply from the versions printed in public chronicles. At first, this power was used quietly, a subtle reminder to a monarch that the Vatican had records of a questionable decision might be enough to guide his choices in the present. A discreet sharing of a historical detail could sway negotiations in the Church's favour without a single threat being spoken. Over time, this became a deliberate strategy. The archive was no longer just about keeping history safe from decay. It was about deciding who could use history and when. The Church began to understand that revealing certain information at the right moment could influence political outcomes just as surely as armies on a battlefield. And just as importantly, withholding information could keep dangerous truths from sparking unrest or undermining authority. By the late 18th century, this approach had matured into a kind of quiet diplomacy. Ambassadors and envoys might meet behind closed doors in Vatican chambers, discussing matters of state with full awareness that the Pope's representatives had centuries of documented evidence to draw upon. The archive became a silent participant in these conversations, its unseen contents adding weight to the Church's position. Even in matters of religion, the archive's influence grew. Disputes over doctrine could be settled or prolonged based on which ancient writings were brought forward and which were left buried. A council could be swayed by a document said to date back to the earliest days of the faith, while conflicting evidence stayed in the shadows. This selective unveiling of history gave the Vatican a kind of control no other power could match. Nations could be conquered, alliances could be built or broken, all with a few sheets of paper drawn from a vault beneath the city. From that point on, the Apostolic Archive was no longer just a passive repository. It was an active instrument of power, a hidden hand guiding events across the world. And the most remarkable thing is that even as it played this role, it kept its image as a place of scholarship and preservation, a disguise so perfect that few outside the inner circle understood just how much influence those locked shelves truly carried. In the year 1633, Galileo Galilei stood before the Roman Inquisition, accused of heresy for supporting the idea that the Earth moved around the Sun. The official record tells us he was forced to recant under threat of punishment and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. That is the version taught in schools and printed in textbooks. But rumours have long whispered that the Apostolic Archive holds far more detailed records of Galileo's trial, pages that never saw the light of day. Some say these hidden documents contain transcripts of private conversations between Galileo and church officials, conversations that hint the Vatican knew his ideas were correct, but feared the chaos such knowledge might bring to a world where scripture was taken as absolute truth. Others believe the papers reveal secret agreements that allowed Galileo to continue his work quietly under certain conditions, suggesting his punishment was less about silencing him forever and more about controlling how and when his discoveries would spread. There are even claims that these trial records include letters from other scientists of the time, some of them clerics, who supported Galileo in secret, and shared evidence that has since been lost. If true, this would paint a very different picture of the Church's relationship with science in the 17th century. Instead of a simple clash between faith and reason, it would look more like a calculated effort to manage the flow of revolutionary ideas. The Vatican has released some documents related to the trial, but these are carefully chosen pieces that align neatly with the official narrative. The rest remain locked away. Scholars who have worked in the archive say that even mentioning the Galileo papers can lead to polite but firm redirection toward other subjects. This only fuels speculation about what is being kept hidden. If the unreleased records truly contain nothing more than mundane legal notes, why protect them so fiercely after nearly 400 years? The secrecy suggests that the Galileo story we know may be only part of the truth. Perhaps the missing pages would show that the trial was less about one man's belief and more about the Vatican's desire to maintain control over knowledge that could upend the order of the world. Or perhaps they would reveal a side of Galileo himself that history has chosen to forget. Whatever the case, the idea that somewhere in those deep corridors lies a box of papers that could rewrite one of the most famous episodes in the history of science is a reminder of the archive's enduring power. It is not just about what is kept, but why it is kept. And until the day those pages are brought into the light, we are left to wonder whether Galileo's final words to the court were truly of surrender, or if behind those closed doors he left history a message we were never meant to hear. In the early 14th century, the Knights Templar fell from grace in one of the most dramatic downfalls in history. Once celebrated as warrior monks defending pilgrims and guarding Christian lands, they were suddenly accused of heresy, blasphemy, and dark secret rituals. By order of King Philip IV of France, and with the cooperation of Pope Clement V, the Templars were arrested, tortured into confession, and many were executed. The official story is one of guilt and punishment, but hidden in the Apostolic Archive, there is said to be a collection of documents known as the Chinon Parchment, sometimes referred to as the Templar Dossier. This set of papers, discovered by a Vatican archivist in 2001, but still largely inaccessible to the public, suggests that the Templars may have been absolved by the Pope himself before their deaths. According to the fragments that have been revealed, Pope Clement conducted a secret inquiry into the charges and found the order guilty of certain minor faults, but not of the heresies they were accused of. In other words, the Vatican may have believed the Templars were innocent of the worst crimes, even as they allowed them to be destroyed by political forces. If the complete dossier were ever released, it could completely rewrite the narrative of the Templars from that of a corrupted order to victims of a calculated power grab. But this raises a troubling question. If the Pope knew they were not guilty, why did the Church stand by as they were burned at the stake? Some believe the documents might reveal the full extent of the political pressure the Vatican faced from King Philip, whose debts to the Templars gave him every reason to see their downfall. Others think the papers could expose alliances and secret deals between the Church and the Crown that would still be embarrassing even today. There are also legends that the Templars possessed treasures and knowledge brought back from the Holy Land, items or writings that could challenge the foundations of Christian history itself. If such things are mentioned in the dossier, it would explain why parts of it remain in the deepest parts of the archive. What has been shown to the public offers a glimpse, but not the full truth, leaving open the possibility that the Knights Templar were not only wrongfully condemned, but were silenced to keep something far larger from being revealed. The Templar story has always been a mix of fact and myth, but somewhere under the stone floors of Vatican City, the answer may lie in ink on parchment, waiting for the day when someone dares to open the entire file and finally tell the world whether the knights were villains, heroes, or something far stranger. During the dark years of the Second World War, Pope Pius XII led the Catholic Church through one of the most turbulent periods in modern history. His role has been the subject of fierce debate for decades. Some see him as a quiet hero who worked behind the scenes to protect Jews and other victims of Nazi persecution. Others accuse him of remaining silent in the face of atrocities, choosing diplomacy over moral outcry. The truth, many believe, lies within the Vatican Apostolic Archive in what are known as the Pius XII files. These wartime records are said to contain detailed correspondence between the Vatican and governments across Europe during the war, including Nazi Germany. There are whispers of letters sent directly to Hitler, reports from church envoys embedded in occupied territories, and internal discussions weighing the political consequences of speaking out too strongly against the regime. Some documents may even reveal what the Vatican knew about the Holocaust as it was happening, and how early that knowledge reached Rome. Critics have long argued that the Church's cautious approach allowed evil to flourish unchecked, while defenders claim that public condemnation would have led to harsher persecution and closed off the Vatican's ability to help people in secret. The files could confirm either side of the argument, or perhaps reveal a more complicated reality where moral conviction collided with geopolitical strategy. In recent years, the Vatican has taken steps to open some of these archives to researchers, but access is still limited and carefully controlled. Scholars who have managed to review parts of the collection report a mix of routine diplomatic exchanges and chillingly direct descriptions of wartime events. What remains locked away are the documents that could offer the clearest answers about what the Pope truly knew, when he knew it, and why he acted, or failed to act, the way he did. For many, the stakes are more than historical. The legacy of Pope Pius XII shapes how the Church is remembered in the modern world. Canonization efforts, interfaith relations, and the moral authority of the Vatican all hinge in part on the story these files tell. If they prove that the Pope worked tirelessly to save lives, history may grant him honour. If they reveal deliberate silence in the face of mass murder, the shadow over his papacy will only deepen. Somewhere in those wartime papers is the unfiltered record of one of the most controversial chapters in Church history. Until the full truth is released to the public, the debate will rage on, fed by the knowledge that the answers already exist. Locked away in the same city where the bells of St. Peter's still ring over cobblestone streets that once carried the footsteps of messengers racing with the news of a world at war. For centuries, the Bible has been seen as the definitive Word of God, a sacred collection of writings chosen and preserved by the Church. But there have always been whispers that not every gospel, letter, or prophecy made it into the version the world knows today. Somewhere beneath the stone floors of Vatican City, it is said there are manuscripts, some nearly 2,000 years old, that tell stories of Jesus and the early Church, unlike anything found in the New Testament. These hidden Gospels may speak of events left out of the official narrative, teachings that challenge traditional doctrine, or accounts from followers whose voices were silenced when the canon was decided. Historians know that in the early centuries of Christianity, dozens of writings circulated among believers. Some offered radically different views of Christ's life and mission. Others presented theological ideas that clashed with emerging church authority. At church councils in the 4th and 5th centuries, decisions were made about which texts would be considered divinely inspired and which would be cast aside. Many of those rejected writings disappeared from history, yet fragments have resurfaced over time, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary, showing that entire perspectives were left out. If the Vatican truly holds complete copies of such works, the implications would be enormous. Imagine a gospel describing events in Jesus' life that contradict what billions have believed for generations. Imagine a letter from one of his apostles revealing doubts, disputes, or details that could transform how faith itself is understood. The Church's official position is that no secret gospels are being hidden away, but the very idea has persisted for so long because it fits so neatly with the archive's culture of secrecy. Some scholars believe that if these texts exist, they are kept from public view not only to protect the faithful from confusion, but also to preserve the Church's authority over interpretation of Scripture. In a faith where the Bible is the foundation, adding or altering even one book could shake the ground beneath centuries of teaching. If the hidden Gospels were ever released, they might inspire a deeper and more complex understanding of early Christianity, or they might fracture it completely. The thought that somewhere in the dim, climate-controlled corridors of the Apostolic Archive, there could be ancient scrolls that rewrite the story of Jesus is both thrilling and unsettling. Until the day such writings are revealed, they will remain part of the great mystery of what lies behind those locked doors. A reminder that history is not only about what we have been told, but also about what has been left unsaid. History is taught as a steady march of years, a clear timeline stretching from the ancient world to today. But deep inside the Apostolic Archive, there are said to be documents that could challenge the very order of that timeline. These are not the usual disputes over the exact date of a battle or the birth of a king. They are records suggesting that entire centuries may have been added, altered, or misrepresented somewhere along the way. This idea, sometimes called the phantom time theory, proposes that parts of what we think of as the Middle Ages might never have happened at all, or that events we place centuries apart may have been much closer in reality. The Vatican has never confirmed holding such records, but some researchers claim that letters, astronomical charts, and royal decrees in its collection do not align with the accepted dating of history. For example, an official record might place an eclipse in a year when science tells us no such eclipse occurred, or a papal letter might reference a ruler believed to have lived long after that pope's death. On their own, these anomalies could be dismissed as copying errors. But if they are numerous and consistent, they begin to form a pattern that suggests the timeline itself was once deliberately adjusted. Why would anyone do this? Theories range from simple political convenience to grand conspiracies designed to legitimize rulers or rewrite the origins of nations. If certain centuries were fabricated or shifted, it would mean the story of civilization has been built on a foundation that does not exist. The archive, with its vast and unmatched collection of original documents, is perhaps the only place in the world where such evidence could be pieced together with certainty. And that is precisely why, if it exists, it may never be made public. To admit that the official chronology is flawed would not just alter textbooks, it would undermine trust in every historical record that follows. It would call into question the dating of religious events, the lineage of royal families, even the development of science and technology. For the Vatican, which has long positioned itself as a guardian of history, such a revelation could be as destabilizing as any theological dispute. Until someone is allowed to examine these alleged documents without restriction, the chronology question will remain just that, a question. But the idea that behind those locked doors could be proof that our calendar, our history, and even our sense of time have been manipulated is a reminder of how fragile the past can be, and how easily it can be shaped by those who hold the pen. Among the treasures whispered to be hidden in the Apostolic Archive are letters written by kings and emperors whose words could still shift the way we understand centuries of diplomacy. These were not polite greetings or ceremonial congratulations. They were candid messages between the most powerful men in the world and the Pope, written in moments of crisis, ambition, or desperation. Some of these letters may contain admissions of political manipulation, secret alliances, or betrayals that never appeared in public records. Imagine a king confessing his intent to break a treaty while still presenting himself as a loyal ally, or an emperor offering the church land, wealth, or influence in exchange for support in a war. Such correspondence would not only reveal the personal motives behind great events, but could also prove that the church was deeply involved in shaping them. There are stories of letters from medieval monarchs asking the Pope to legitimize questionable successions, granting their claim to a throne that might otherwise have been challenged. Others are said to contain warnings of invasions or uprisings that were never recorded in official histories, suggesting that some conflicts were avoided or resolved entirely in secret. These documents could show that behind the grand speeches and public decrees, diplomacy was often a private conversation between a ruler and the Vatican. If the Church advised a king to make peace, he might have listened not out of faith alone, but because he knew the Pope could influence his allies and enemies alike. If the Pope promised support, it might have meant more than spiritual blessing. It could have meant soldiers, money, or intelligence that tipped the balance of power. The existence of such letters would also raise questions about what the Vatican chose to do with this information. Did they use it to guide nations towards stability, or did they leverage it to strengthen their own position in the world? In some cases, the archive may hold both sides of a correspondence, allowing historians to see the entire exchange in a way no other source could. Yet, access to these materials is nearly impossible. The Vatican argues that many are bound by privacy agreements or diplomatic protocol, even centuries after they were written. But this continued secrecy only fuels the belief that what is inside those envelopes could change the way we see the political map of history. If released, these royal letters might show that the lines between church and state were never as clear as we were taught, and that the true history of diplomacy was written not in treaties carved into stone, but in ink, in confidence, and in the knowledge that the walls of the Vatican would guard those words for as long as it was necessary. Tucked away in the farthest reaches of the Apostolic Archive, there are said to be maps that defy the history we have been taught. These are not ordinary navigational charts, but detailed depictions of continents, coastlines, and islands drawn long before their official discovery. Imagine a map from the 15th century showing the outline of Australia more than 200 years before it was supposedly first sighted by European explorers. Picture a parchment with the precise shape of Antarctica, not covered in ice, suggesting it was charted in a time when the continent's shores were still visible. Such maps would upend the story of exploration, raising the possibility that ancient civilizations or early travellers had far greater knowledge of the world than we realize. Some researchers believe the Vatican's collection includes cartography inherited from the age of the Roman Empire, perhaps even older, passed down through centuries of conquest, trade, and missionary work. The Church's reach extended to every corner of the known world, and its envoys often returned with more than letters and relics. They carried knowledge, geographical, cultural, and scientific, that could be as valuable as gold. In some cases, this knowledge may have been recorded in exquisite detail by mapmakers whose work never left the Vatican's vaults. These secret maps might also explain certain historical mysteries, such as how early navigators seemed to know of distant islands before they were ever charted in public records. If a captain in the 16th century sailed directly to a remote land, was it luck, or was he working from a map that had been hidden from the world? The question then becomes why the Church would keep such maps secret. Perhaps they were seen as too dangerous, offering routes to treasures, resources, or territories that could trigger conflict among nations. Or perhaps they contained information that contradicted the accepted history of discovery, revealing that European explorers were not the first to reach certain lands. The existence of such evidence could diminish the glory of empires and challenge the narrative of Western expansion. The Vatican has never acknowledged holding maps of this kind, yet fragments and second-hand accounts have slipped into the historical record. An archivist might mention a chart with an unfamiliar coastline or a sea captain's log referring to a place that should not have been known at the time. Each of these hints feeds the legend of the secret maps, drawing treasure hunters, historians, and conspiracy theorists into the same web of curiosity. If ever revealed, these maps could reshape the world's understanding of human exploration, proving that the story of discovery is not a straight line from ignorance to knowledge, but a winding path where some truths were found, forgotten, and found again, only to be locked away beneath the stones of Vatican City. Across centuries, Catholic missionaries ventured into some of the most remote corners of the world, bringing with them the teachings of the Church and returning with stories no one else in Europe had ever heard. Many of these accounts were sent back to Rome in carefully written reports meant for the eyes of church officials alone. While some were eventually published and shaped the way Europeans viewed distant lands, others vanished into the depths of the Apostolic Archive, never to be seen by the public. These hidden reports are said to describe civilizations in ways that defy what history books tell us today. Imagine reading the words of a 16th century missionary in South America who claims to have encountered cities of stone and gold far larger than any ruins we know, or an account from Asia describing advanced medicine and technology that would not appear in Europe for another 200 years. Some letters may detail customs, languages, and beliefs that were later erased or rewritten to fit a more convenient narrative. There are even rumours of reports from Africa describing complex kingdoms with libraries and universities rivaling anything in Europe at the time, contradicting the long-standing myth that such sophistication did not exist there before colonial influence. These writings would have been incredibly valuable to the Vatican, not just as records of the world's diversity, but as intelligence. Knowing the strengths, weaknesses, and resources of foreign nations could give the Church leverage in political and economic matters. Missionaries were often the first Europeans to set foot in these regions, which meant their words could shape policy and strategy back home. But they also witnessed beliefs and practices that challenged Church doctrine. A missionary who wrote about shared creation myths, similar moral codes, or spiritual visions outside of Christianity might have been unintentionally undermining the Church's claim to unique truth. Such information could be seen as dangerous, not because it was false, but because it suggested that God's presence was not confined to the Christian world. Over time, these reports would accumulate, forming a hidden chronicle of human history far richer and stranger than the simplified version taught in schools. Yet they remain sealed away, perhaps because releasing them would require admitting that our understanding of the past has been shaped not only by what was discovered, but by what was deliberately withheld. Somewhere in those locked rooms are the voices of men who travelled across oceans, faced unknown dangers, and wrote down what they saw with their own eyes, only for their words to be stored in silence, waiting for a day when the world might be ready to hear them. Hidden somewhere in the dim corridors of the Apostolic Archive, there are said to be papers and sketches that tell the story of ideas the world was never meant to see. These are not myths or vague rumours, but specific accounts from inventors, scholars, and thinkers whose work challenged the accepted beliefs of their time. Some of these science files may describe machines capable of feats centuries ahead of their era, while others outline theories that predicted discoveries we would not make until the modern age. In the centuries, when the Church held enormous influence over what knowledge was acceptable, a new idea could be seen as a blessing or a threat. If it supported scripture or church teaching, it might be celebrated. If it contradicted doctrine or undermined the Church's authority, it could vanish into secrecy. There are whispered stories of a medieval inventor who designed a device that could produce continuous motion, a concept that would have disrupted the understanding of natural laws at the time. Another tale speaks of a manuscript describing a way to harness the power of the sun to produce heat and energy, written long before the first solar panels were imagined. Then there are the theories about the origins of the universe that mirrored what we now call the Big Bang, centuries before modern science would name it. The suppression of such ideas was not always about denying the truth. Sometimes it was about controlling how and when that truth was revealed. The Church may have feared that certain inventions would be used for destructive purposes, or that radical theories would cause chaos among the faithful. By keeping these discoveries hidden, they could maintain stability, or at least the appearance of it. But in doing so, they may also have slowed human progress in ways we will never fully measure. The science files might also contain the voices of scientists who were silenced in more subtle ways, their work dismissed, their reputations damaged, their names erased from history. A theory we now attribute to a later thinker may have existed earlier, hidden in a box under lock and key, while the world continued without it. If these papers were ever released, they could change not just the history of science, but the story of how civilization itself developed. We might learn that the seeds of modern technology were planted far earlier than we believed, or that entire branches of discovery were cut off before they could grow. For now, the science files remain out of reach, sealed away in a place where time stands still, their contents waiting for the day when the barriers to knowledge finally fall, and the world learns what it has been missing for centuries. Buried deep within the Apostolic Archive, there are said to be scrolls, parchment logs, and bound ledgers filled with meticulous observations of the sky. These ancient astronomical records, some of them copied from even older sources, detail eclipses, comets, planetary alignments, and strange lights that moved across the heavens. On the surface, they might seem like harmless curiosities, the kind of thing that would interest only historians of science. But the real reason they are so carefully guarded, according to whispers, is that some of these observations do not fit the official historical timeline. An eclipse recorded in the year we now call the 9th century may not match what modern astronomy tells us should have been visible at that time. A comet described in vivid detail may appear centuries before or after its calculated return. In some cases, the records list multiple celestial events in the same year that science says could not have occurred together. On their own, these could be explained as copying errors or exaggerations by ancient observers. But when patterns emerge, when dozens of records from different regions all disagree with the accepted chronology, they suggest something far more unsettling. It raises the possibility that the way we measure history itself might be flawed, that certain periods have been stretched, compressed, or misplaced entirely. Some researchers believe these contradictions could support the idea that parts of the so-called Dark Ages were artificially inserted into the calendar, altering our sense of when key events took place. Others think the records might reveal that earlier civilizations had a better understanding of the cosmos than we give them credit for, perhaps even predicting celestial events with uncanny accuracy. If such knowledge existed, it would challenge the idea that scientific progress has been a steady climb. The Vatican's possession of these records makes sense when you consider that the Church was one of the greatest patrons of astronomy for centuries. Monasteries and observatories under Church control recorded the skies with diligence unmatched in much of the world. This means the archive could hold a nearly unbroken chain of astronomical data stretching back more than 1,000 years. Releasing it would allow modern scientists to test our timelines against the night sky itself, and that may be exactly why it remains locked away. If the stars and planets tell a story different from the one in our history books, the implications would ripple through every field, from archaeology to theology. For now, these ancient sky charts sit in the dark, their precise drawings and careful notes hidden from view, while above the Vatican the same stars wheel overhead, keeping their own silent record of time that no lock or key can change. Gaining entry to the Vatican Apostolic Archive is not as simple as walking up to the gates and asking politely. The process is deliberately complex, wrapped in layers of formality that seem designed as much to keep people out as to let them in. Officially, any qualified scholar can apply, but the definition of qualified is set entirely by the Vatican. Applicants must present academic credentials, proof of ongoing research, and a detailed explanation of exactly what they hope to find. This is not a vague description or a general topic. It is a precise statement of the documents they wish to consult, often down to specific dates and catalogue numbers. This immediately creates a paradox. If you do not already know what is inside, how can you ask for it? Those who pass this first hurdle must also demonstrate fluency in the languages of the documents they want to study, which often means Latin, Italian, or even Greek. On the surface, this makes sense, but in practice, it eliminates a vast number of researchers who might have fresh perspectives but lack rare linguistic skills. Even once approved, researchers face strict limitations. They are allowed in only during certain hours. They may request only a small number of items per day, and photography or scanning is forbidden. Notes must be taken by hand, and everything is monitored by staff. The most intriguing part is that the archive is not one open space where you can browse shelves. You submit a request, and staff bring you the specific document you asked for. If you do not know it exists, you will never see it. This system effectively filters out not just the unqualified, but also anyone whose work might drift into areas the Vatican does not wish to explore. In theory, this is about preservation and order, but to many, it looks like a way to ensure that only safe research reaches the outside world. Stories circulate among academics of applications denied without explanation, or of sudden policy changes that make a planned study impossible. Some say there is even an unspoken blacklist of researchers whose previous work was too controversial. The result is that a vast portion of the archive remains effectively invisible, not because it is physically inaccessible, but because the process ensures that the people most likely to ask dangerous questions are never allowed inside. For those who are granted entry, the experience is often described as both awe-inspiring and frustrating, seeing centuries-old manuscripts up close, yet always aware that behind locked doors there are countless more that you will never be permitted to touch. In this way, the archive guards its secrets not only with locks and walls, but with bureaucracy, a system that hides the past in plain sight while claiming to offer the keys to anyone who is worthy. Inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive, the rules are as much a part of the experience as the documents themselves, and none is more frustrating to researchers than what is often called the one document rule. Unlike a normal library or archive, where you can browse shelves, discover unexpected material, or follow your curiosity wherever it leads, the Apostolic Archive allows you to request only a specific document you already know exists. This means you must provide its exact reference code, title, and date before you can see it. If you cannot name it, you cannot read it. On the surface, this rule is presented as a matter of preservation. The Vatican argues that limiting handling of fragile manuscripts protects them from damage. But in practice, it has another effect. It prevents accidental discoveries. If a researcher comes across something shocking in a typical archive, it might lead them to uncover a bigger story. Here, that is impossible unless you already have the trail mapped out before you even walk through the door. This also means that what you find is limited by what the Vatican has chosen to list in its public catalogues, and those catalogues are far from complete. Many entries are vague, with descriptions so minimal they reveal nothing about the document's true content. Others are not listed at all, meaning that entire collections are invisible to anyone who does not have inside knowledge. Scholars have described the strange feeling of working in the reading room, surrounded by the knowledge that behind those walls are tens of thousands of shelves filled with history, yet knowing they will only ever be allowed to touch a few small pieces of it. Some compare it to looking at a vast banquet through a keyhole, able to sample only what a waiter decides to bring you. This rule shapes the kind of history that gets written from the archive's material. Since researchers must already know exactly what to ask for, most studies confirm or expand upon existing narratives rather than uncovering something entirely new. The rule also acts as a filter for sensitive material. If a document is considered too controversial or dangerous, it may be kept out of the catalogue altogether, ensuring no one can request it without prior approval from the right people. Whether by design or by tradition, the one document rule ensures that the Vatican remains the gatekeeper of its own history. What the world learns depends entirely on what is asked, and what is asked depends entirely on what is already known. For a place that holds some of the rarest and most mysterious records in human history, it is a system that keeps the past on a tight leash, allowing small glimpses of truth while the rest remains locked away in the dark. When a document finally emerges from the depths of the Vatican Apostolic Archive and into the hands of the public, most people assume they are reading it exactly as it was written centuries ago. But there are quiet stories among scholars of edits, omissions, and subtle changes made before a manuscript is ever shown to the outside world. These silent revisions are rarely acknowledged and never openly discussed by Vatican officials, yet traces of them have surfaced often enough to keep the rumours alive. Sometimes the changes are obvious, a section of a letter missing entirely, pages replaced with copies written in a different hand, or certain names carefully removed. Other times they are more delicate, involving small adjustments in wording that can completely change the meaning of a statement. A single altered phrase in a diplomatic exchange can turn a promise into a suggestion, a confession into a mere rumour. The reasons for these edits are never officially explained. Defenders of the practice say that certain passages are removed for privacy, to protect individuals or communities who might still be affected by the contents, even centuries later. Critics argue that this is a convenient way to control the narrative, to release a version of history that aligns with the Church's preferred story while keeping more damaging truths hidden. There are recorded instances where researchers who had previously seen an original document returned years later to find that what they were given to read was not quite the same. In one case, a scholar studying a series of papal letters noticed that entire paragraphs discussing financial arrangements with a European monarchy had disappeared from the version now available. In another, references to unusual astronomical events had been edited out of a missionary's travel diary, leaving the published text looking far less remarkable. The Vatican's system for controlling documents makes this process easy to hide. Since researchers are never allowed to browse the shelves themselves, they cannot compare different copies or versions of the same record without explicit permission. If a document is replaced or altered, there is no way for an outsider to know unless they remember the original well enough to spot the differences. The most unsettling part of this practice is that it blurs the line between history and storytelling. When even the rare materials released to the public may have passed through an unseen filter, how much of what we think we know about the past is truly authentic? Silent revisions ensure that the Vatican remains not only the keeper of history, but also its editor, shaping what survives for the world to see. It is a quiet power, exercised in ink and absence, and it may be the most effective way the Church has of keeping certain truths hidden while still appearing to share them. Inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive, the archivists are far more than caretakers of old paper. They are the gatekeepers of knowledge, the ones who decide not only how history is preserved, but also which parts of it survive at all. To the outside world, their work may seem purely technical, maintaining temperature and humidity, restoring fragile manuscripts, organising shelves that stretch for miles, but behind the quiet professionalism is a level of influence that few people ever consider. An archivist decides which documents are deemed significant enough to be repaired and kept, and which can be left to fade into dust. They determine the descriptions that appear in catalogues, shaping how a researcher perceives a record before they ever read it. In some cases, they can even control whether a document is ever seen again. The decisions they make are rarely questioned because they happen within a closed system, away from the public eye. When a scholar requests a document, it is the archivist who retrieves it. If the item is withheld due to damage, classification, or some vague reference to policy, the researcher has no way of challenging the decision. And while the archivists themselves may not write history books, their choices silently direct what material is available for historians to use. This means they can influence the shape of historical narratives without ever putting pen to paper. In a place like the Apostolic Archive, where the walls hold more than 12 centuries of human record, the power to decide what remains accessible is immense. Some archivists have been known to act with fierce loyalty to the Church, guarding its reputation by ensuring certain items remain hidden. Others are rumoured to have quietly protected controversial works from destruction, believing that one day the world would be ready to see them. Over centuries, the identity of these gatekeepers has changed, but their role has remained the same: to manage the delicate balance between preservation and control. They are entrusted with secrets that could alter the way we understand religion, politics, science, and culture. And because they live and work in a space that most people will never enter, they hold a kind of invisible authority over the past. Without them, the archive would be nothing more than a silent labyrinth of paper. With them, it becomes a living system, constantly shaped by human judgment. Whether that judgment serves truth or hides it is a question no outsider can easily answer. What is certain is that the archivists are not just witnesses to history, they are its quiet architects, deciding what will be remembered and what will be lost in the shadows forever. There are moments when researchers inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive come face to face with the kind of censorship that cannot be explained away as missing pages or accidental damage. They open a manuscript, a diary, or a letter only to find entire sections blacked out, sometimes with thick ink strokes that obliterate the text completely, other times with precise boxes drawn around the removed passages as if to signal exactly where the secrets begin and end. These are not clumsy acts of vandalism from history. They are deliberate redactions, often done in such a way that the surrounding words remain perfectly readable, making the absence feel even more intentional. Scholars who encounter them describe the same feeling, a mixture of frustration and curiosity, knowing that they are holding an original piece of history, yet being shown only a carefully filtered version. The reasons for these blackouts are never stated. Officially, the Vatican insists that any redactions are for privacy, to protect sensitive information about individuals or events that could still have consequences today. But this explanation raises its own questions. How can something written hundreds of years ago still be dangerous? And if the past must be hidden to protect the present, what does that say about the truth it contains? In some cases, the blacked-out sections are surrounded by hints of their content. A redacted portion in a diplomatic letter might be followed by a sudden shift in tone, suggesting a serious warning or a secret agreement. In a missionary's journal, the inked-out lines might sit between descriptions of daily life and strange references to unusual celestial phenomena. These gaps act like missing puzzle pieces, and the human mind cannot help but try to fill them in. Over time, stories of these encounters have circulated among the small community of scholars who have worked in the archive, turning the blacked-out pages into their own kind of legend. Some claim to have glimpsed faint outlines of the original writing beneath the ink, barely visible under certain light, only to have their materials quickly removed by staff. Others say they returned to the same document years later, only to find the redacted section had been replaced with a fresh copy, the missing content gone entirely. Whether the blackouts are meant to protect, to manipulate, or simply to maintain control, they serve as a physical reminder that in the Apostolic Archive, knowledge is not just preserved, it is managed. Every stroke of black ink tells the reader that someone, somewhere, decided that part of the story should not be told. And perhaps the most haunting part is that the act of hiding something can make it feel even more significant than if it had been left in plain sight. Among the most unsettling rumours about the Vatican Apostolic Archive is the idea that within its locked rooms lies evidence that the history we know has been deliberately rewritten, with entire centuries either inserted into the timeline or erased from it completely. This theory, whispered among certain historians and researchers, suggests that somewhere in those miles of shelves are documents that do not align with the official sequence of events. Imagine finding a legal record dated to a year when, according to mainstream history, the event it describes could not have happened because the city it names had not yet been founded. Or a chronicle from a monastery describing an eclipse or a comet in a year that astronomers know does not match the skies of that period. Such anomalies, taken alone, could be dismissed as mistakes, but taken together, they start to form a pattern that points to missing years or phantom time that was later filled in with invented events, rulers, and even wars. Some researchers believe this may have happened to consolidate political power, synchronize conflicting calendars, or give legitimacy to certain dynasties by stretching their lineage back further than it truly went. If the Vatican holds the master records of these timelines, then it holds the key to unraveling one of the greatest historical puzzles of all time. The implications are staggering. If even a small portion of recorded history was fabricated or erased, then the foundations of what we believe about the past would be shaken. It would mean that monuments we date to one century might belong to another, that famous battles might never have happened, and that entire generations could be little more than names on parchment. The archive's reputation for secrecy makes it the perfect place for such evidence to remain hidden. Scholars allowed inside are restricted to specific documents they already know to request, which means they cannot stumble upon contradictory records by accident. And if a particular manuscript reveals too much, it can be withheld, redacted, or simply filed in a section that is never open to outsiders. This control over the timeline is not just about protecting church history. It could be about protecting the shared story of civilization itself. For now, the missing years remain a shadowy theory, pieced together from scraps, coincidences, and whispers from those who claim to have seen documents they should not have. But if the archive ever opened its doors fully, and the timelines within were compared to the ones we use today, we might discover that the past is not a straight road stretching backward into truth, but a carefully constructed map with entire stretches drawn in or erased to suit the needs of those who controlled the pen. Deep within the Vatican Apostolic Archive, there may be documents so powerful that their value goes far beyond history. These are records that could act as political bargaining chips, capable of influencing the decisions of presidents, monarchs, and entire governments. They might take the form of private correspondence revealing long-buried scandals, treaties that were never made public, or financial records showing secret dealings between powerful nations and the Church. Imagine a letter from a 20th century leader confessing to a crime that could still tarnish a family's political dynasty, or a hidden agreement between rival countries that would rewrite the understanding of a major war. Such material, in the right hands, could change the course of international relations. While the Vatican presents itself as a spiritual authority above politics, history shows that it has often been deeply entwined in global affairs. Possessing sensitive documents gives it an advantage in negotiations, allowing it to subtly encourage certain outcomes without ever appearing to interfere directly. A conversation with a head of state could take on a different tone if the Vatican quietly reminds them of a file in the archive that might not be flattering should it ever come to light. The beauty of such leverage is that it does not have to be used openly. The mere knowledge that the Vatican has a copy of a particular document can be enough to sway decisions. This is not blackmail in the crude sense, but a softer form of influence, a reminder that the past is never truly gone, and that the Church, as one of the oldest continuous institutions on earth, remembers far more than most governments. This power is strengthened by the fact that the archive is almost completely closed to the public. No one can verify exactly what is inside, which means speculation alone can be enough to make leaders cautious. Even the possibility that compromising material exists can encourage cooperation or silence opposition. It is a form of diplomacy that relies not on armies or trade agreements, but on memory, locked away in paper and ink. Over the centuries, the Vatican's role as a trusted repository of secrets from all over the world has made it uniquely positioned to hold such bargaining chips. Envoys, ambassadors, and rulers have deposited sensitive information there, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes under pressure, and sometimes without realizing how it might be used in the future. The result is an unseen layer of political power, one that operates quietly behind closed doors, while the public sees only the ceremonial and religious side of the Holy See. In this way, the archive is more than a library. It is a vault of influence, where the past is not just preserved, but kept ready in case the right moment comes to turn a forgotten document into a decisive tool on the global stage. While most people imagine the Vatican Apostolic Archive as a labyrinth of shelves lined with ancient books and manuscripts, there are persistent whispers that its most intriguing possessions are not written at all. Some believe that hidden deep within the vaults are relics and artifacts of immense historical, religious, and even mystical value. These could range from sacred objects mentioned in scripture to items from lost civilizations whose existence is still debated. The Vatican has long been the recipient of gifts, offerings, and seized treasures from across the world. Over centuries, missionaries, explorers, and emissaries returned from distant lands carrying more than letters and reports. They brought back sacred idols, fragments of ancient temples, maps etched on stone, and objects whose craftsmanship seemed centuries ahead of their time. Many of these items were likely placed under lock and key, either to protect them or to ensure they never disrupted accepted narratives. There are stories of a chest containing objects from the Temple of Solomon, smuggled to Rome during times of war and hidden away ever since. Others speak of fragments of the Library of Alexandria, scrolls and tools that somehow survived the Great Fire and found their way into the hands of the Church. More sensational accounts claim that relics associated with Christ, the Apostles, or early saints may rest in the archive rather than in public reliquaries. Even beyond the biblical, there is speculation about artifacts tied to ancient technologies, such as mechanisms resembling early computers or navigation instruments capable of charting the globe centuries before European exploration. The secrecy surrounding these items fuels endless debate. If the archive holds objects that could change our understanding of history, why are they not displayed for the world? The Vatican might argue that such treasures require extreme preservation measures or that their true origins remain uncertain. But others suspect that revealing them could unravel established historical timelines or challenge religious doctrine in ways the Church is unwilling to risk. The idea of non-document treasures also adds a layer of mystery to the already impenetrable nature of the archive. It suggests that the hidden world beneath Vatican City is not just a record of the past, but a physical collection of it, objects that have touched the hands of kings, prophets, and explorers. And if even a fraction of these rumours are true, then the Apostolic Archive is not simply a storehouse of words, but a silent museum of wonders that could, if ever revealed, alter the way humanity sees its own story. Until that day comes, these relics and artifacts remain locked away in darkness, their presence known only to a select few, while the rest of the world is left to imagine the treasures sleeping under the heart of Rome. Among the countless shelves of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, there is said to be one volume unlike any other. Known in whispers as the Book of Names, it is rumoured to contain a list of individuals whose lives were directly shaped by the influence of the Church, some protected, others targeted. The origins of this book are uncertain. Some say it began as a register of allies, a record of those who had aided the Vatican's mission and were therefore under its protection. Over time, according to the stories, it may have evolved into something far more complex, a ledger of influence, cataloguing both friends and adversaries across the centuries. Those protected might include rulers who quietly supported the Church's causes, scientists whose work was spared from suppression, or entire families whose survival in times of war depended on a discreet word from Rome. On the other side, the book may record names of those considered dangerous to the Church's power, individuals whose ideas or actions threatened its authority. The implications of such a list are staggering. If it exists, it would be a map of hidden alliances and rivalries stretching across nations and generations. Historians speculate that the book could reveal how certain figures seemed to rise to prominence against all odds, or why others suddenly fell from power without clear reason. It could connect events across centuries, showing how influence was applied like an invisible hand guiding the course of history. The secrecy surrounding this alleged volume fuels endless curiosity. If the Vatican truly maintains such a record, its contents would not only be politically explosive, but deeply personal. Names on the list could belong to living descendants of powerful families, creating ripples in modern politics, business, and academia. For this reason alone, the Church would have every incentive to keep it locked away. Some former insiders claim the book is updated even in modern times, suggesting that the Church's network of influence did not fade with history, but continues quietly today. Others believe the book is not a single physical object, but a collection of records spread across different sections of the archive, brought together only when needed. Whether it is bound in leather and hidden in a locked cabinet, or preserved in scattered files known only to a few, the legend of the Book of Names persists because it represents the kind of power that never needs to be spoken aloud. It is the power of knowledge about people, where they come from, what they value, and what they fear. And, if such a record truly exists within those sealed corridors, it may be one of the most guarded and dangerous volumes in human history, for it holds not just the story of the past, but the levers of the present. Tucked away in the farthest reaches of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, there are said to be manuscripts that defy the very idea of history as a record of the past. These are the so-called prophecy files, ancient and medieval writings that appear to predict events far beyond the time in which they were created. According to the whispers of scholars who claim to have caught glimpses, these documents range from cryptic poems and coded letters to full narratives describing wars, disasters, and political upheavals centuries before they occurred. Some are linked to well-known seers and mystics, their names preserved in legend, while others are penned anonymously, their authorship as mysterious as the accuracy of their predictions. Imagine a parchment dated to the 14th century that seems to foretell the rise of global wars in the 20th, or a bound volume from the early church era describing the collapse of empires that had not yet even been founded. If such documents exist, their impact on both faith and politics would be immense. The Church's stance on prophecy has always been complex. Publicly, it treats predictions with caution, distinguishing between divine revelation and superstition. Privately, however, the preservation of these writings suggests that someone believed they were worth keeping safe, even if their contents were too disruptive for open discussion. Skeptics argue that such manuscripts might simply be clever forgeries created long after the events they supposedly predict, inserted into older collections to give them an air of mystery. But if that were true, why keep them hidden rather than debunk them outright? The answer may lie in the nature of the predictions themselves. Some may speak not just of the past and present, but of events still to come, naming places, dates, or leaders that have yet to appear on the world stage. Others could challenge the Church's own teachings by suggesting timelines or outcomes that conflict with established doctrine. The existence of these files also raises an unsettling question. If the Vatican holds manuscripts that seem to accurately foresee history, has that knowledge ever been used to influence decisions? Could a prophecy about a great famine, a revolution, or a leader's downfall have shaped the way the Church positioned itself in certain moments of history? Such possibilities make the prophecy files a source of both fascination and fear. In a world where most archives preserve only what has already happened, these alleged writings reach forward into the unknown, holding the potential to unsettle the very flow of time. Whether they are divine insight, coincidence, or something else entirely, they remain locked in the silence of the archive, their words waiting for a day when the future they describe has either arrived or been avoided altogether. Over the centuries, a select few scholars have gained access to the Vatican Apostolic Archive and emerged with more than just notes and citations. Some left convinced they had stumbled upon something that was never meant to be seen, and their stories often share a troubling pattern. At first, there is excitement, sometimes even hints in academic circles that they are working on a discovery of great significance. Then, suddenly, the trail goes cold. Their work is halted, their funding disappears, or their professional reputation crumbles under a wave of criticism. In some cases, they vanish from public life altogether. These are the scholars who, according to whispered accounts, went too far. One story tells of a historian who claimed to have found evidence contradicting the established date of a major biblical event, something that would have shifted centuries of religious interpretation. Before he could publish, his access to the archive was revoked without explanation, and his university distanced itself from his research. Another involves a linguist who believed she had uncovered a translation of an ancient gospel never included in the Bible. Soon after mentioning it at a closed academic gathering, she was accused of plagiarism in unrelated work and quietly faded from the scholarly community. Whether these incidents are coincidence or part of a deliberate effort to suppress certain findings is impossible to prove. The Vatican maintains that access can be revoked for procedural violations or because of the fragile condition of certain documents. But for those who see a pattern, the connection is clear. Cross an invisible line, and you risk being cut off not just from the archive, but from your career. There are also rumours of more direct interventions. Some researchers have claimed that their notes were confiscated during routine inspections before leaving the archive, or that photocopies they requested arrived with entire sections missing. Others tell of being assigned a minder, an archivist who seemed to watch their every move, steering them away from certain topics or documents. For those who value academic freedom, these stories serve as warnings. The archive is a place where curiosity must be carefully measured, where every request can be interpreted as a signal of intent. The scholars who went too far remind us that, in a world of restricted knowledge, access is not a right, but a privilege that can vanish without warning. Whether their discoveries were truly dangerous or simply inconvenient, their sudden silence lingers like an unfinished sentence, leaving the rest of us to wonder what truths they might have been about to tell before the door to the past was quietly closed behind them. In February of 1929, the Lateran Treaty transformed the Vatican into an independent state, ending decades of tension between the Holy See and the Kingdom of Italy. On the surface, it was a diplomatic agreement that settled the so-called Roman question, granting the Church sovereignty over a small walled enclave in the heart of Rome in exchange for formal recognition of the Italian government. But for decades, there have been whispers that the treaty contained far more than the public terms suggest, and that some of its most significant clauses are buried not in legal archives, but deep within the Vatican's own vaults. According to historians who have studied the period, the negotiations between Benito Mussolini's government and the Vatican were as much about power as they were about peace. Publicly, the deal secured territory, financial compensation, and recognition. Privately, some believe it also involved a series of understandings that would give the Church influence over Italian politics, while granting Mussolini certain assurances in return. There are rumours of secret agreements concerning the control of religious education, the handling of sensitive historical records, and even the coordination of messaging between the Church and the regime during key political moments. One persistent theory claims that the Vatican promised to keep certain archives closed in exchange for guarantees about its independence and tax privileges. Another suggests that financial arrangements went beyond the published figures, with investments and property transfers concealed from public view. Such hidden clauses would explain how the relationship between Mussolini's fascist government and the Vatican remained unusually stable in the years that followed, even when the regime's policies clashed with church teachings on paper. The Apostolic Archive, as the final resting place of the original documents and correspondence, would be the only place such details could be confirmed. But with access tightly controlled, the truth remains locked away. For the Church, revealing any hidden terms now could damage its reputation or spark new debates about its political neutrality. For Italy, it could reopen uncomfortable questions about the compromises made during a volatile period in history. What is known for certain is that the Lateran Treaty reshaped the political map of Europe's smallest state and cemented the Vatican's position as both a religious authority and a political entity. What is less certain and far more intriguing is whether its true cost was measured only in money and land, or also in silent promises exchanged behind closed doors, written into documents that may never see the light of day. Until those papers are brought out of the archive, the full story of 1929 will remain a mixture of history and speculation, with the truth hidden behind the same walls that the treaty itself brought into existence. During the chaos of the Second World War, the Vatican faced a threat unlike any in its modern history. As bombs fell on cities across Europe and occupying forces tightened their grip, the Apostolic Archive became more than a repository of history. It was a vault of political, religious, and cultural treasures that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. Quietly and without public announcement, a series of wartime evacuations began. Certain documents, some centuries old and others of immediate political importance, were removed from their shelves and taken to undisclosed locations. The decision was not just about preservation, but about control. Many of these files contained sensitive information that, if captured, could have been used to influence governments, disrupt alliances, or even sway the outcome of the war itself. Moving them ensured that no invading power could exploit their contents. The routes and destinations of these evacuations remain one of the Vatican's most closely guarded secrets. Some accounts suggest that documents were hidden within other church properties scattered across Europe, disguised among ordinary parish records, or buried deep in monastery cellars. Others hint at secure vaults beneath friendly nations' embassies, or inside private estates whose owners owed loyalty to the Holy See. The number of people who knew the full scope of the operation was small, perhaps only a handful within the highest ranks of the Vatican administration. Even among archivists, the details were compartmentalized, with each person responsible for only a fraction of the relocation. This way, if anyone were captured or interrogated, they could not reveal the whole picture. The wartime evacuations also raise questions about what was considered valuable enough to save. Was it only rare manuscripts and irreplaceable relics, or were there politically sensitive files, correspondence with world leaders, records of clandestine negotiations, evidence of financial transactions that the Vatican wanted beyond the reach of prying eyes? The fact that some of the evacuated materials have never returned to the public sections of the archive fuels speculation that certain items were deemed too dangerous to bring back into even the most restricted rooms. After the war ended, much of Europe emerged into an era of rebuilding, but the story of the Vatican's wartime evacuations remained in the shadows. No official acknowledgement was given, no list of safeguarded items published. For the outside world, it is as if the operation never happened. Yet within the archive, there are quiet signs. A missing entry in an otherwise complete catalogue, a gap in a sequence of diplomatic letters that hint at a time when the guardians of the Vatican's secrets took extraordinary steps to ensure that history's most sensitive chapters remained exactly where they wanted them, hidden. In an age when almost every library, museum, and government archive is racing to digitize its collections, the Vatican Apostolic Archive stands as a curious exception. While small portions have been scanned and made available to select scholars, The vast majority of its treasures remain firmly locked in their original form, accessible only by physically entering its heavily guarded reading rooms. The official explanation is familiar. Digitization is costly, the materials are delicate, and the sheer volume of the collection makes the task monumental. But those who have studied the Vatican's history of secrecy suspect there is more to it than preservation concerns. A fully digitized archive would, by its very nature, be harder to control. Even with access restrictions, the risk of leaks would grow exponentially. A single copied file could be shared across the world in seconds, bypassing the centuries-old system of carefully managed access. Once a document is online, it cannot be quietly recalled, redacted, or erased. There is also the matter of context. Many of the Vatican's holdings are complex, their meaning dependent on related documents, handwritten marginal notes, or unique seals. Digitizing them without the surrounding material could strip away this context, allowing partial or misleading interpretations to spread unchecked. For an institution that has always been meticulous about how history is presented, such a loss of control would be unacceptable. Some insiders quietly suggest that the reluctance runs deeper. In a digital system, it would be far more difficult to hide the existence of certain documents. Even a restricted database would require cataloguing each item, and that catalogue could itself become a dangerous map for curious minds. A researcher, seeing a title or description, even without the content, might start asking questions that the Vatican has no interest in answering. The irony is that in some ways, the archive is already more secure in its centuries-old form than it ever could be in the digital realm. A medieval manuscript locked in a climate-controlled vault can only be seen by one person at a time under strict supervision. But once that manuscript becomes a high-resolution scan, it becomes vulnerable not to theft in the physical sense, but to the unstoppable spread of information in the digital world. And so the Vatican maintains its modern digital barrier, allowing technology to transform the rest of the world, while its greatest secrets remain bound in leather, ink, and parchment. It is a decision that keeps the past firmly anchored in the present, and for those who believe the archive holds more than history, it is also a reminder that sometimes the most effective way to guard a secret is simply to refuse to let it leave the room at all. If the doors of the Vatican Apostolic Archive were thrown open tomorrow, the world would wake to a storm unlike anything in modern history. Scholars, journalists, and ordinary citizens would flood into its corridors, pulling from the shelves not just dusty manuscripts, but the hidden threads of centuries. The first days would be chaos, a race to uncover what had been concealed for generations. News outlets would battle for exclusive revelations, while social media exploded with images of long-lost documents. Historians would scramble to rewrite timelines as letters from kings, suppressed gospels, and forgotten treaties came to light. Some discoveries would be celebrated as treasures of human culture, filling museums and classrooms with a richer understanding of the past. Others would spark outrage, shaking the foundations of political powers, religious institutions, and even national identities. Imagine the reaction if ancient maps showed lands charted centuries before their supposed discovery, or if files revealed secret alliances between enemies that had publicly fought for decades. There could be confirmation of rumours long dismissed as conspiracy theory, proof of events deliberately erased from history books, or evidence that certain decisions were made not by chance but by careful, hidden design. Governments might demand the return of artifacts or the suppression of certain revelations. Families tied to names in the documents could face scrutiny, scandal, or unexpected fame. The religious impact would be just as seismic. If hidden gospels or early church writings challenged long-held teachings, believers might struggle with questions that go beyond history into the realm of faith itself. For the Vatican, centuries of careful control over its image and authority could fracture in days. Yet, there would also be hope in such an opening. The release of the archive could unite researchers from every field and every corner of the globe, creating the most ambitious collaborative effort in the history of knowledge. Historians, linguists, scientists, and theologians might work side by side, not just to learn what is inside, but to understand what it means for humanity's shared story. And still, even in that imagined future, there would be shadows. Not every document could be examined immediately, and in the rush to interpret, errors would be made. Some truths might be distorted, others overlooked entirely in the flood of discovery. But one thing would be certain: the world could never again pretend that the past was neatly tied up and fully known. The opening of the archive would be the lifting of a veil, revealing a landscape both wondrous and unsettling, where the story of humanity is richer, stranger, and far more complicated than we have ever been allowed to believe. There is a question at the heart of every debate about the Vatican Apostolic Archive, one that reaches beyond locked doors and dusty manuscripts. If all the knowledge hidden within were revealed at once, would it save humanity or plunge it into chaos? It is a dilemma as old as the human thirst for truth. On one hand, knowledge is light. It strips away lies, corrects mistakes, and gives people the tools to make better choices. If the archive contains evidence that can rewrite history, expose injustice, or reveal the roots of belief systems, then keeping it locked away feels like a betrayal of humanity's right to understand its own story. Entire cultures could reclaim forgotten parts of their heritage, and long misunderstood events could be seen with clarity for the first time. Yet history also warns us that sudden revelations can be dangerous. When core beliefs are shaken, people do not always respond with reason. Revolutions, uprisings, and even wars have been sparked by changes far smaller than what might come from opening the archive in a single day. The truths inside could touch every corner of human life: religion, politics, science, identity, and in doing so, they might destabilize the very structures that hold societies together. Some philosophers argue that truth must be revealed gradually, in doses people can absorb without tearing apart the world they know. Others counter that such thinking is simply another form of control, a way to keep power in the hands of the few. The Church has long positioned itself as a steward of both faith and knowledge, and perhaps part of its reasoning for secrecy lies in this tension. If knowledge is a gift, it is also a burden. Some truths could bring unity, bridging divisions between cultures and religions. Others could deepen divides, creating fractures that would take generations to heal. The question then becomes not just whether humanity deserves all truth at once, but whether it can survive it. Imagine a single revelation capable of undermining centuries of belief, or proving that some of the most trusted historical narratives were crafted rather than recorded. For some, this would be liberation. For others, it would be betrayal, and in that clash between joy and despair, the fate of entire nations could shift. Perhaps that is why the archive remains closed, why the gatekeepers choose silence over risk. It is easier to live in a world where the limits of knowledge are invisible, where the boundaries are mistaken for the whole. But if those boundaries were ever erased, humanity would face a choice: to wield truth as a tool for building something better, or to let it unravel the fragile order we have built. In that moment, knowledge could become either salvation or the spark of chaos. The Vatican Apostolic Archive has always been more than a collection of documents. It is a symbol of the limits placed on human curiosity, a reminder that there are rooms in the house of history we are not yet allowed to enter. For centuries, it has been the locked door at the end of a corridor, one that countless scholars, dreamers, and skeptics have approached only to find it firmly closed. And like any locked door, it invites speculation about what lies on the other side. Some imagine treasures of knowledge that could change the way we understand ourselves, while others see dangers so great they justify the secrecy. But the truth, whatever it may be, remains hidden, because the key to that door is incomplete. The key is not a single object, nor is it in the pocket of one powerful figure waiting to decide when to use it. It is scattered across time and people, made of persistence, demand, and the slow erosion of silence. Every historian who questions the official story, every journalist who brings the archive into public conversation, every ordinary person who wonders aloud why some truths must be hidden, each adds a piece to that unfinished key. The Vatican has held its ground for centuries, but history shows that even the most guarded gates can open when enough voices push against them. If the archive is a door, then public awareness is the hand that will one day turn the lock. It will not be easy. Those who guard the archive understand the power of mystery, and they know that curiosity fades if left unanswered. That is why the asking must continue. The more people know about the locked rooms beneath Vatican City, the more the absence of answers will matter. Perhaps one day, the key will be complete, forged by the combined efforts of generations who refuse to let the questions fade. And when that happens, the unlocking will not belong to any single person or moment. It will be the work of everyone who dared to wonder what they were not supposed to know. Until then, the archive remains in its silence, the great unbroken door waiting in the shadows. It stands as both a challenge and an invitation, reminding us that history is not just something we inherit, but something we have to fight to see in full. The key is not finished, but it is being made. Piece by piece, question by question, the hand that will one day turn the lock is taking shape. And behind that door, whatever truth waits, it is already listening for the sound of footsteps approaching.